Hello and welcome to another video from English Matters. Today we're going to be looking at Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy. Now this is a poem obviously that features in the AQA Anthology, Love and Relationships. I've already gone through this poem and I've underlined a few of the bits that have interested me about it. But first, before we get into the poem, I'll urge you to click subscribe and click that bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Also, this works best obviously if you have a hard copy of the poem and you annotate it as we go through it. So first of all, we need to think about what is the poem about. Well, essentially it's a love poem, but it focuses on the sadness felt at the end of a relationship. It's very much about looking back in many respects. The overall tone of the poem, it's very much given in the title, of course, neutral. In other words, it's not full of emotion. In fact, it's quite unemotional, very cold and very distant in that respect. And certainly one of the ways Hardy achieves a sense of neutrality of tone is by giving details to the setting. He seems to give a lot of details about the setting, but not so much about the kind of inner turmoil, really. It's almost as if the outer world is somehow analogous with what's going on inside. And what's going on inside is it tends to be a very closed, cold, shutting down, unemotional response. But he does this as well, interestingly, structurally, he does this by using short, simple phrases. He uses short, simple phrases, and what is the effect of those short, simple phrases? Effectively, they build up a picture without giving any details or describing the person he addresses. The person he addresses is fairly anonymous in many respects. Certainly with this poem there's a lot of imagery relating to nature and certainly relating to colours, of course. And the colours that are mentioned are white, grey and greyish. Now granted, the poem does take place on a winter's day when things do tend to be rather beigeish. Nevertheless, we can't help but feel that the lack of colour is somehow almost a metaphor for the lack of colour regarding the inner life of the poet. We can't help but feel that it seems very bleached in many respects, unemotional, detached. But we can't help but feel that these sort of greyish tones very much reflect the emotional state of the person in the poem. We can't help but feel that there's a sense of everything being bleached of colour, being bleached of life, and it's very unemotional and detached and sterile almost in many respects. So let's think about form before we actually read through the poem. Now the poem has 4 stanzas. Each stanza is made up of 4 lines, they're quatrains, and it has a ABBA pattern. Now this was a pattern that was very popular with sort of folk poetry and sort of ballads and things like that. Now folk poetry and ballads became very popular during the Romantic period. Obviously Thomas Hardy comes after the Romantic period, but nevertheless he was very influenced by the Romantic poets like Shelley, for example. Also, he uses the pattern, also the rhythm. Really, it's written in sort of iambic quadrimeters, followed by trimeter, which is also very common in sort of folk poetry as well. And it also gives it a very slow, ponderous feel to it in many respects. So, what else can we say about form and structure? Well, certainly the first 3 stanzas centre around a specific memory. And then there's a time jump, which is perhaps represented by the ellipsis here. There is a time jump where we get a sense of reflection, a sense of looking back. In many respects, it reminds me very much of the Byron poem, When We Two Parted. And this poem would be ideal to write about those two together if you get the opportunity. So with no further ado, let us read through the poem. We stood by a pond that winter day. Well, stood suggests immediately lack of movement, lack of motion. There's a stillness to that. There's a stillness overall to this poem, apart from the fact you could argue it's a stirring memory. By that, a very specific that winter day. So obviously the subject of the poem must know which winter day he's alluding to. And the fact that it's winter obviously fits in nicely with the poem as well, because the weather reflects feelings in many respects. There's an emotional coldness, a distancing towards each other as well, which is reflected very much in the language and the imagery of the poem. Then we get the second line, and the sun was white. Now the sun obviously has connotations of brightness and warmth, but the fact that it's white, it seems to suggest that it's almost bleached, that there is no warmth in the sun at all, obviously because it's a winter day, but also it perhaps suggests there's no warmth between the couple either. As though chidden of God. Interesting, so it's an old-fashioned word. Chidden means to chide, to tell off. In other words, it's as if the sun's been told off by God. And then we get the next line. And a few leaves lay, that lovely alliteration, again suggests stillness, lack of motion, lack of movement, on the starving sod. Sod is obviously ground, but again that alliteration emphasises suffering, starving sod, suffering. It's obviously it's personification as well. The ground there is being personified. They had fallen from an ash and were grey. Obviously, the idea of fallen suggests descent. And ash, obviously he's referring to an ash tree, but ash could also mean ashes, i.e. the embers of a relationship that has burnt out in many respects. All the warmth and passion is gone, and were grey. And the colour there is significant in many respects for the emotional state, or the kind of suggestive of this sort of emotional residue after this relationship. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove. Now that's interesting really, because eyes as a general conceit in love poetry, when a poet talks about the eyes, it tends to be very gushing, hyperbolic, over romantic terms. But here he's kind of turning that convention on its head really, by suggesting that they were eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago. Her eyes on me were eyes that rove. In other words, she doesn't look at him squarely, she just averts her gaze. Rove over, that lovely sort of enjambment as well. It kind of, the enjambment itself mimics the movement of her eyes over his face. The adjective here, tedious riddles. Now riddles are kind of like wordplay of years ago, but the fact he uses the adjective tedious suggests that there was no sort of pleasure there to be had, and some words played between us to and fro. It's almost as if playing games would have been something that would have been enjoyable or have a sense of fun or romance to it. It is all bereft of anything anymore. It has a very deathly quality in many respects, this poem. Obviously it's the death of a relationship. On which lost the more by our love. Again, we've got a lot of sort of game or playful imagery, but it seems to be bereft of any joy as well. And we get the lovely next stanza, which is quite interesting. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing. It's fairly oxymoronic really, because smiles can't be dead. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die. It's a very a false smile in many respects, and almost as if the smile itself sucks the life out of everything else. And also the fact that the smile is so fleeting and unemotional. She lets the smile die in the same way that the relationship is allowed to just die. And a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird of wing. Now obviously a grin has very negative connotations. I mean, there's a big difference between saying, oh, somebody smiled at me today and somebody grinned at me. Grin has a very sinister connotation to it. Grin of bitterness swept thereby. Then we get that wonderful simile, like an ominous bird of wing. Now obviously that bird of wing would have been seen as an omen of something ending. And we get the ellipsis. The ellipsis there marks a juncture where we lose a sense of the past, and the poet moves us to the present. Since then, keen lessons, I mean keen here means sharp, so it has associations with pain. Keen lessons that love deceives. Obviously it's a generalisation here, that love deceives. And rings with wrong. A lovely, again, that alliteration that emphasises sort of pain. Have shaped me your face, and the God-cursed sun. Obviously the God-cursed sun immediately takes us back to the first stanza when we think of chidden by God. But this seems harsher. Cursed has a harsher sound to it, almost as if the poet has gotten more and more bitter with age. And a tree and a pond edged with greyish leaves. Greyish leaves suggest decay, the relationship has decayed. And the mention of the pond, of course, takes us back to the first stanza. So it has a cyclical structure. So it's very much in the nature of trauma. A trauma is where something rolls round and round in your head and you just can't get past it. And it seems to be what's happening here in many respects, very much like the Byron poem. There's no doubt when we read this poem we can't help but feel that there's a sense of lifelessness about it in many respects. It's almost as if he, and also a point that's worth mentioning, that he uses very unspecific determiners. Unspecific determiners like a few and some. It's almost as if he can't be bothered to relate how many there were or even count them. Such is his disinterest with everything. So in that respect, it's a poem that very much deals with, the kind of almost an existential crisis of one failing to find any sort of meaning in life or find any sort of hope or meaning in love, shall we say. Anyway, it is an interesting poem, and should you get this in your exam, I think a great one to compare it to would be Byron's When We Two Parted. They both deal with love and bitterness and failed and broken relationships in many respects. But also Winter Swans and The Farmer's Bride also uses imagery of nature to reflect troubled relationships. That could be a good one. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Please share this video with anyone you know who's currently studying for their GCSEs. Please click like and subscribe, and don't go anywhere. Please wait for the next upload.